She arrived at the airport before sunrise, carrying only a small black backpack and a folded jacket over her arm. The terminal was half awake, filled with the quiet buzz of rolling suitcases and tired travelers holding coffee cups. She moved through security with the calm rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her ticket said seat 14B, a middle seat. Not her favorite, but it didn't matter. She wasn't flying for comfort. She was just trying to get home. When she reached the gate, she sat by the window and watched the sun rise over the runway. The light spread slowly across the tarmac, painting the silver wings of the parked planes gold. Around her, people were still waking up. A young couple whispering over a phone, a man in a business suit typing furiously, a little boy tugging his mother's sleeve asking if they'd see clouds up close. She smiled quietly at that. She had seen more clouds than most people would in a lifetime. When the boarding announcement came, she waited until most passengers had gone in. No rush. She moved with quiet purpose, scanning her ticket once more before stepping down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Flight attendants greeted her with practiced warmth. She gave a polite nod and found her seat halfway down the aisle, 14B. A middle seat between a college kid wearing headphones and an older woman knitting something bright blue. She slid into her seat, placed her backpack under the chair in front of her, and buckled in. As passengers continued to board, she looked around, observing, not judging, just noticing. That's what she always did. The young man beside her was clearly nervous. His leg bounced nonstop, maybe first time flying. The older woman seemed completely at peace, humming softly while looping her yarn. The cabin filled with the chatter of people finding seats and overhead bins closing with loud thuds. When the captain's voice came over the speaker, she barely listened. Years of flights had made her tune out those announcements. She knew the script by heart. Estimated flight time, cruising altitude, weather in Washington, seatbelt signs. Routine words. The plane taxied out, engines humming louder, and she closed her eyes for a moment. Takeoff always brought a strange mix of peace and nostalgia for her. The rumble beneath her feet, the tilt of the nose, the feeling of being pressed gently back into the seat. It all used to mean something else. Back then, she wasn't sitting behind the cockpit door. The engines roared. The plane lifted smoothly. A few passengers clapped softly, the kind of innocent habit you only see on morning flights. She smiled faintly, keeping her thoughts to herself. Once they leveled out above the clouds, she opened her backpack and pulled out a small notebook. Its cover was worn, corners bent. She flipped through a few pages filled with short notes, numbers, and flight paths drawn in pencil. Out of habit, not need. The college kid beside her glanced over. "Are you a pilot or something?" he asked, half joking. She looked up, surprised by his curiosity. "Used to be," she said simply. He smiled. "That's cool. Commercial?" She shook her head, a small pause before she added, "Different kind of wings." He didn't press. She liked that. Most people would. He went back to his music and she returned to her notes, drawing small circles and arrows. Old habits die hard. A few hours in, the cabin settled into quiet. People were reading, watching movies, dozing off. Flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle offering drinks. She asked for black coffee, nothing else. Outside the window, the sky was a clean blue, that endless open blue she used to call home. From where she sat, it was peaceful, but she knew the airspace they were flying through. Somewhere far below, invisible on radar to the passengers, was a military corridor, one she had once patrolled herself. She sipped her coffee and stared out the window, thinking of the last time she'd worn the uniform. The weight of the helmet, the cold of the cockpit glass before sunrise, the heartbeat in her ears right before takeoff. She'd left that world behind, or at least tried to. The intercom buzzed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been advised of some turbulence ahead, so please remain seated for a bit." A few sighs filled the cabin. The seatbelt light came on. She didn't worry. Turbulence didn't bother her. She'd flown through storms that could swallow smaller planes whole. The plane jolted slightly, a quick bump. The boy across the aisle gripped his mother's arm. She smiled at him gently, nodding to reassure him it was normal. Then something changed. It wasn't big, not yet, but she felt it before most people did. The hum of the engines altered just a shade off from what it should be. The plane adjusted course more sharply than normal, banking left, then leveling out again. She looked up. The seatbelt sign blinked. A flight attendant hurried past, whispering to another near the front. The older woman beside her stopped knitting. "That felt different," she said quietly. "Just a course change," she replied softly. But inside, she wasn't convinced. She glanced out the window again. The blue sky was the same, but something about the movement of the clouds, the direction they were heading, told her they'd shifted. Old instincts flickered awake. She opened her notebook again, not to draw, but to think. Commercial planes didn't just change altitude that fast unless they were rerouted. Maybe weather, maybe traffic, or maybe something else. She told herself not to overthink. She wasn't in control of this flight, not anymore. Still, her mind mapped the airspace automatically. If they were where she thought, then they were near restricted military airspace and the kind used for training exercises. And on a weekday morning, that meant fighter activity. She took a breath and looked at the screen showing their flight path. It had paused. Signal lost. That was odd. The captain's voice came back, calm but tighter this time. "Folks, just a quick update. We're experiencing some minor communication issues with air traffic control, but everything is under control. Please stay seated." To most, that sounded harmless. To her, it meant something else. Losing contact with ground control wasn't minor. It triggered a chain of protocols, one she knew by heart. She leaned back in her seat, thinking. Somewhere out there, radar screens would be flashing. A controller would be trying to re-establish contact. And if they couldn't, there was only one next step: scramble and intercept. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't afraid, just alert. She looked around the cabin. The passengers were calm, unaware of anything unusual. The flight attendants smiled reassuringly as they checked seatbelts. No one knew they were flying blind, at least for the moment. She pressed her hand against the window and squinted toward the wing. The sunlight was blinding, but for a brief moment she thought she saw something. A flicker of movement far out in the sky. A glint, metallic and fast. Probably nothing, she told herself. But she knew the difference between reflection and afterburn. The woman beside her was knitting again, trying to distract herself. "You seem calm," she said. "You fly often?" She smiled faintly. "You could say that." Another bump. Slightly sharper. The engines adjusted. The college kid pulled off one headphone. "Are we turning again?" "Just a small detour," she said automatically, though she was watching closely now. The cabin lights dimmed a little as the plane turned east. Through the narrow window, the sunlight shifted angle, and she saw it again. A shape in the distance, just at the edge of sight. Sleek, gray, and far faster than anything commercial. She knew that silhouette instantly. An F-22 Raptor. Her pulse quickened. Not from fear, but memory. So they really had scrambled jets. Which meant this wasn't a routine glitch. She leaned back slowly, eyes still fixed outside. The passengers were still calm, chatting, reading, unaware that somewhere beyond their window supersonic aircraft were closing in. She took a slow breath. The world had a strange sense of humor, she thought. Out of all the people on this flight, she was probably the only one who had sat in that cockpit, worn that helmet, and felt that power beneath her hands. And now she was in Seat 14B, a civilian among civilians. The engines steadied again. The captain's voice came once more, trying to sound relaxed. "We're in contact again, folks. Nothing to worry about. We'll continue on our adjusted route and should be in D.C. on time." A few people clapped again, relieved. She didn't clap. She kept her gaze on the horizon, where she could still see that faint silver shape tracing along their altitude, distant but deliberate. The F-22s were still there, escorting, not attacking. Watching. She smiled to herself. A private smile only the sky could understand. They had no idea who was sitting in seat 14B. The seatbelt sign was still glowing, though the turbulence had stopped. People were restless now, glancing around, checking the flight tracker screens that no longer worked. A few whispered to each other, wondering what minor communication issue really meant. She kept her expression calm, but her mind was working fast. Years of training had left her with an instinct for patterns, the way the plane had changed, direction, the short loss of radio, and the faint presence she had spotted in the sky earlier. Those things didn't just happen together by accident. The captain had said they were back in contact, but she could tell from the tone of his voice that wasn't completely true. He was keeping the passengers calm. That was his job. But something in his delivery told her he was still waiting for confirmation from the ground. She glanced out the window again. The sky looked empty now, bright and still. But she knew better. The F-22s would be flying slightly above and behind, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. They were trained for that, to approach quietly, unseen until they wanted to be seen. She folded her notebook and slipped it back into her bag. There was nothing she could do for now except stay alert. The flight attendants moved through the aisles again, smiling a little too brightly. One of them paused near her row, checking seatbelts and tray tables. When their eyes met, the attendant gave her a small nod, as if trying to reassure herself more than the passengers. The older woman beside her leaned in. "You think everything's okay, dear?" She smiled gently. "Yes, they're just being careful. That's all." The woman seemed satisfied, returning to her knitting, though her hands trembled slightly. The plane continued on. The hum of the engines grew steadier. A few passengers went back to reading or watching movies, trying to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't. She could feel it, that subtle tension in the air, like the quiet before a storm. Minutes passed. Then a low, muffled sound reached her ears. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable to someone who knew it. The sharp rip of jet engines cutting through thin air at high altitude. She turned her head toward the window again. This time she didn't see anything. The sky was too bright, the clouds too thin, but she knew what that sound meant. The F-22s were repositioning. She took a deep breath and sat back, her heart beating just a little faster. She'd been on the other side of this before, the pilot responding to a silent aircraft, waiting for visual confirmation. Hand resting near the radio switch, eyes scanning for the tail number. It was a strange feeling now, being inside the aircraft that was under watch. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, calm and steady but with a hint of tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder to remain seated. We're coordinating with traffic control to confirm our new route. Everything is fine and there's no need for concern." The college kid beside her looked uneasy. "What's going on?" "Probably just a system glitch," she said softly. He nodded but didn't look convinced. She could see his reflection in the window, the nervous look, the shallow breaths. She almost told him the truth, but there was no point in worrying him. The truth was simple. When an aircraft loses communication for too long, the military sends fighters to check it visually. To make sure everything's all right. To make sure it's not something worse. She'd done that job herself once, intercepting planes that had gone silent, most of them harmless. Some weren't. Her gaze returned to the clouds outside. Somewhere out there, two pilots were talking to each other right now, confirming visual contact with this very plane. They were probably wondering who was on board, waiting for instructions. If only they knew. A soft chime sounded, followed by a voice from the cockpit. "Cabin crew, please secure the galley." That usually meant turbulence or descent. But they weren't descending. She checked the flight map on the overhead screen again, still frozen. Then the plane banked gently to the right. Passengers murmured, some pressing their faces to the windows. The older woman gripped the armrest. "Feels like we're turning." "Just an adjustment," she said, her voice calm. But inside her pulse quickened again. Adjustments like that meant rerouting, probably under escort. She leaned closer to the window, shielding her eyes from the sun with her hand. For a second she saw it, a gray streak far off their wingtip, then gone again. It wasn't imagination. The F-22s were now visible, though only if you knew how to spot them. She felt a strange comfort in that, the familiarity of it. The young man beside her leaned forward. "Did you see that?" "Probably another plane," she said quietly, trying to ease his nerves. He looked uncertain but sat back. She kept watching, mind tracing through old call procedures, how pilots made visual contact, how they signaled to civilian planes. She could almost hear the chatter on the encrypted channel. Then the captain's voice came again, softer this time, almost personal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to maintain this altitude for a short while. Please stay seated and enjoy the flight." The words "we've been asked" caught her attention. That wasn't normal phrasing. That meant they were following external instructions, military coordination, most likely. She pressed her lips together. There was a certain irony in it. The Air Force itself had trained her for this, and now she was a passenger while others carried out the same protocol she once led. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the echo of the past in her mind, the calm of pre-flight checks, the feel of her gloves on the throttle, the rush of air at supersonic speed. Those memories felt like another lifetime, but they lived close beneath the surface. When she opened her eyes again, the clouds outside had shifted, darker now, casting long shadows across the wings. The F-22s had probably moved closer, staying invisible but within reach. The flight attendants walked briskly down the aisle, collecting cups and trays. They were polite, smiling, but she could see the strain around their eyes. They knew something was unusual, too. Time passed slowly. 10 minutes, 15, no announcements. Then the intercom clicked once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're returning to normal communication and should be resuming our regular route shortly. We appreciate your patience." Applause rippled through the cabin. People smiled, relieved she didn't clap. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. She knew that before any communication was restored, the pilots outside would have visually confirmed their tail number. They would have radioed in, reporting that the aircraft was stable and that no signs of trouble were visible. That meant someone inside the cockpit had probably flashed a transponder code manually, the reassurance signal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation had reached higher channels than the passengers would ever know. New calm settled over the cabin. The young man put his headphones back on. The older woman returned to her knitting. The steady hum of the engines filled the silence. She relaxed slightly, though she kept watching. Old habits never really died. Somewhere far behind them, the fighters would still be trailing at a safe distance, monitoring until full communication was confirmed. She stared at the faint line of the horizon and whispered under her breath, too quietly for anyone to hear, "You're clear to break off." Boys. It was something she'd said countless times before, when missions ended safely. A quiet smile touched her face. The captain made one last announcement. "We'll begin our descent in about 40 minutes. Weather in Washington is clear and we expect an on-time arrival." Passengers relaxed completely this time. The tension drained away, replaced with laughter and soft conversation. But she kept thinking about the invisible pilots outside, the ones who had responded without hesitation, just like she used to. Somewhere up there, 2 men were returning to base, reporting that the situation was normal. They would probably never know that one of their own was sitting quietly in seat 14B, calm and silent while they watched over her plane. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were steady now. Her coffee cup sat empty on the tray table. She reached for her notebook again and opened it to a blank page. For a long moment, she just looked at it, the empty white space, and then began to write. Slowly, carefully. Sometimes the sky calls you back, even when you think you've left it behind. She stopped and smiled faintly. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about connection, the silent thread between people who understood the language of the sky. The older woman beside her glanced over. "Writing something nice?" "Just a thought," she said softly. The woman nodded, knitting quietly, unaware that the person next to her once guided the very aircraft that had watched them moments ago. The plane continued smoothly toward Washington. The clouds opened up, revealing the faint curve of the world below. As the sun dipped lower, painting everything gold, she leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. To everyone else, she was just another passenger heading home. but to the two fighter pilots now heading back to base. Her presence had unknowingly shifted the tone of their mission. They had saluted the sky without realizing they were saluting one of their own. And in that quiet cabin, miles above the earth, she let herself breathe easy again. For now, seat 14B was just a seat, but fate wasn't done with her yet. The cabin lights were dim now, soft and golden, the kind that made people sleepy. Dinner trays had been cleared and most passengers were quietly resting. The hum of the engines was steady, like a long sigh that filled the silence. She hadn't slept. Her eyes stayed on the faint reflection in the window, where she could still see flashes of distant light. Not lightning, but the kind of steady gleam only aircraft gave off. The F-22s were still there. She knew it. They had stayed longer than usual. That wasn't standard escort protocol. Something was off. She checked her watch. They should have been halfway through descent by now. Instead, the aircraft was still holding altitude. The captain hadn't made an announcement in nearly half an hour. That silence meant he was busy. Too busy. She took a slow breath and tried to think like she used to. Calm, logical, step by step. If the fighters were still shadowing them, it meant communication wasn't fully restored. Maybe a transponder glitch. Maybe a mismatch with the radar signature. Whatever it was, the military didn't take chances with civilian planes. She reached for her backpack and pulled it into her lap. Inside, neatly folded, was her old military ID, still valid, though rarely used. She kept it out of habit, not pride. That part of her life felt like another person's story. But now that story was catching up to her. The young man beside her had taken off his headphones. "We've been up here a while," he said, checking his watch. "Aren't we supposed to be landing soon?" "Probably some traffic near the airport," she said, her tone easy. "Happens all the time." He nodded, but his brow stayed tight. Still weird. It was weird. The intercom crackled again, the captain's voice steady but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're holding our altitude temporarily due to restricted airspace ahead. Please remain seated. We'll update you shortly." Restricted airspace. That phrase confirmed what she already knew. The plane wasn't where it was supposed to be. Somehow they had drifted or been rerouted too close to military training zones. She knew those boundaries by memory. They weren't forgiving. She unbuckled her belt slightly, leaning closer to the window. This time she saw it clearly. One F-22 flying parallel, maybe a mile off, perfectly steady. The sunlight glinted along its canopy like a small star. The sight stirred something deep in her. Recognition, pride, and a quiet ache. She could almost hear the voice of her old commander in her head. "The sky doesn't forget its own." The older woman beside her noticed her stare. "Is that another plane?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, just keeping an eye on us." "Oh," the woman said softly. "That's comforting, I guess." Comforting wasn't quite the word she'd use. Necessary, maybe. Serious, definitely. Another faint vibration ran through the cabin as the engines adjusted again. The F-22 drew slightly closer, still careful, still silent. The captain's voice came again, this time more formal. "Folks, we're in contact with the military and coordinating instructions. Please stay calm. Everything is fine." That sentence, and "in contact with the military," sent a murmur through the cabin. A few people gasped quietly. Others whispered. The young man beside her turned to her. Why would the military talk to a passenger plane? She could see his nerves rising. "It's just a safety check," she said softly. "They're being extra cautious. You'll be fine." But as she said it, she knew what must be happening in the cockpit. The captain was probably receiving hand signals from the interceptors. Pilots had to respond with specific gestures, flashing lights, rocking wings, or setting transponder codes to prove they were in control. If he wasn't sure what to do, things could get complicated fast. She took another slow breath. Her mind was already running through possible scenarios. If the crew misread a signal, if ground control misheard a report, the situation could escalate. The tension in the cabin was growing now. People were looking out windows, whispering about the fighter jets they thought they saw. The flight attendants tried to keep everyone calm, moving down the aisle with forced smiles. But she could tell from their eyes that they were scared too. Then, something changed. A brief flicker of static came from the speaker above, followed by a faint male voice that wasn't the captain's, distorted, unreadable, but unmistakably military. It lasted only a second before cutting out. Most passengers didn't notice, but she did. She sat straighter. That meant the F-22s were trying to contact the cockpit directly. Maybe the radio wasn't receiving properly, or maybe the captain didn't have the right frequency set. Her heart picked up pace. She couldn't just sit there anymore. Unbuckling quietly, she stood. The flight attendant nearby turned, startled. "Ma'am, please remain seated." She kept her voice low. "I need to speak to the captain. It's important." The attendant shook her head quickly. "I'm sorry, we can't allow passengers." "I'm not just a passenger," she said calmly, holding out her ID. The attendant hesitated, eyes widening as she read the name and insignia. "I need 2 minutes," she said. "Tell the captain Major Carter requests to speak with him. It's about the jets outside." The attendant froze for a second, then nodded, uncertain but trusting the authority in her tone. "I'll check." She waited, standing quietly by the galley as the attendant disappeared through the cockpit door. Around her, passengers were watching, curious. She kept her gaze steady, giving nothing away. Moments later, the attendant returned and opened the door wider. "He'll see you." She stepped forward, her heart steady now. The hum of the instruments filled the cockpit, along with the faint hiss of radio static. The captain turned his head, relief and confusion mixing on his face. "You said you were Air Force?" he asked quickly. "Yes, sir," she said, holding up her ID again. "Retired 187th Fighter Wing. I believe your aircraft is being escorted by 2 F-22s due to a communication loss earlier." He exhaled. "We lost contact for about 8 minutes. We're back now, but they haven't broken formation. They won't until they confirm visually that you're secure," she said. "Did they signal you?" He nodded slowly. "They flashed lights twice. I wasn't sure what they wanted." "They're asking for visual confirmation," she said. "You need to rock the wings slightly, gentle, nothing sharp. That tells them you're under control and not hijacked. Then flash your landing lights twice." The co-pilot turned in his seat, eyes wide. "You're sure?" "I trained the people flying those jets," she said simply. The captain nodded once, confidence flickering back into his face. "All right." He adjusted the yoke carefully. The plane tilted just enough to signal, then leveled out. He flashed the landing lights twice. Outside, through the cockpit glass, she could see one of the distant jets bank slightly in acknowledgement before drifting back into position. "That's it," she said quietly. "They've confirmed. You'll hear from them any second." A second later, the radio crackled again. This time, the voice was clear. "Civilian aircraft, this is Guardian 2. Visual confirmation received. Maintain heading and altitude until further instruction." The captain smiled faintly, tension melting from his shoulders. "Copy that, Guardian 2. She stepped back, letting the crew handle it now. "Thank you, Major," the captain said quietly. "Didn't expect to have an Air Force guardian angel on board." She smiled a little. "Just doing what I can." As she turned to leave, the co-pilot said softly, "Those pilots, they must really respect you." She gave a small shrug. "They were my students once." Back in the cabin, passengers watched her return to Seat 14B. The flight attendant gave her a subtle nod, grateful. Still unsure what had just happened, the young man leaned over. "What was that about?" She smiled faintly, picking up her notebook again. "Just helping clear a little misunderstanding." Outside, the F-22s drifted farther away, holding a loose escort pattern. The sky looked calm again. A voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now cleared to resume normal routing. We'll be descending shortly." Applause filled the cabin. This time even she couldn't help but smile. As the plane began its slow descent, she looked out the window once more. The fighters were still visible for a few moments before banking sharply and vanishing into the sunlight. It was a beautiful sight, powerful and graceful. Just as she remembered, she whispered softly to herself, "Good job, boys." The young man beside her tilted his head. "What did you say?" "Nothing," she said, smiling. "Just talking to the sky." He laughed lightly and went back to his headphones. She leaned back in her seat, feeling the engines ease as the plane began to descend toward Washington. Her reflection in the window looked calm, but inside she felt a quiet rush of pride, not for herself but for the people she had trained, for the discipline that had held steady in the air today. Seat 14B was just another place in the world now, but for one brief moment she had stepped back into who she was, and helped keep everyone safe without anyone truly knowing. Outside, the clouds thinned, revealing the faint outline of the city below. The world felt peaceful again, and she sat silently, watching the horizon fade into gold, knowing that sometimes fate didn't need to shout to remind you where you belonged. The captain's voice faded from the speaker, and the applause slowly quieted. The plane had leveled out, preparing for descent, but a calm stillness filled the cabin, the kind that follows a long breath after tension. She sat quietly, her notebook closed, her hands resting on top of it. Outside the window, the faint glimmer of the F-22s had vanished into the distance, but she knew they weren't far. They would stay in range until the plane crossed back into civilian airspace completely. For most passengers, the excitement was over. They laughed softly now, making jokes about fighter jet escorts and crazy flight stories. People filmed short clips of clouds through the window, turning the moment into something light. But she couldn't laugh yet. She understood how close things had come to becoming serious. A few wrong signals, one moment of confusion, and the sky could have turned chaotic. The flight attendant approached her row again, kneeling slightly beside her seat. "Ma'am, the captain wanted me to thank you again. He said we wouldn't have gotten through that as smoothly without your help." She smiled gently. "He handled it well. I just helped him see the signals." The attendant hesitated, lowering her voice. "Were you really in the Air Force?" She nodded once. "Yes, a while ago." "That's incredible," the attendant whispered, eyes wide. "You must have seen so much up there." "More than I can put into words," she said softly. "But the sky's the same for everyone. Big, beautiful, and unpredictable." The attendant smiled, thanked her again, and went to calm another group of curious passengers. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The sound of the engines was steady again, a sound she had always trusted. She hadn't planned to tell anyone about her past. She didn't like attention, but fate had other ideas. The young man beside her nudged his seat slightly toward her. "You're really calm about all this," he said. "I'd be freaking out if I were you." She smiled faintly. "I've had worse turbulence," he laughed. "You sure sound like someone who's used to flying." "Something like that," she replied. He waited a second. "You're not going to tell me more, are you?" She looked out the window. "Maybe someday. But for now, it's just another flight." The plane began to descend slowly through soft white clouds. The seatbelt light came on again, and the captain's calm voice returned. "We're beginning our approach into Washington. Please make sure your seatbacks are upright and tray tables secured." The older woman beside her put away her knitting and looked over. "You handled yourself beautifully, dear. Everyone else was nervous, but you looked like you'd been through this before." She chuckled lightly. "Maybe a few times." "Well, I hope you're always on my flights," the woman said kindly. "You make people feel safe." That sentence hit her more deeply than she expected. You make people feel safe. She'd once trained to protect skies, not comfort strangers in the middle of them. But maybe that was what life did. It found new ways to use old callings. Through the window, the clouds thinned, revealing a sunset stretched across the horizon. The light painted the wings of the plane in soft gold. The cabin was peaceful again. But then a faint crackle broke over the intercom, a quick burst of static. The captain's voice came back, quiet but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a message of gratitude from the escort unit. They wanted to wish everyone safe travels, and I want to extend special thanks to one of our passengers who offered timely assistance. We are honored to have you aboard." Her eyes flicked up. The passengers murmured, curious, some clapping again, though they didn't know who he meant. She kept her expression calm, pretending to look out the window, but the flight attendant gave her a knowing smile as she passed. The young man beside her caught on. "It's you, isn't it?" She smiled, not denying it, but not confirming it either. "Let's just say I knew what they needed to hear." He grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. "Unreal. You're like a secret superhero." "Nothing like that," she said softly. "Just a person who got lucky to be in the right seat." But her heart told her otherwise. It wasn't luck. It was a calling, one that never fully leaves you. As the plane continued its descent, the sunset deepened into orange and violet hues. The city lights below began to flicker on one by one, like stars rising from the ground. She could almost imagine the F-22s above, breaking formation, returning to base, their mission logged and complete. In their report, they'd probably write something short. "Civilian aircraft confirmed stable. Communication reestablished. Escort released. But somewhere in that chain of communication, word might spread. Someone would say, "You'll never believe who was on board." The thought made her smile. The plane shuddered slightly as it hit a pocket of air, then steadied again. The passengers clapped softly as the landing gear deployed. The soft thud beneath the floor reminded her how far from the fighter cockpit she was, a world where sound meant something different. She exhaled, her shoulders finally relaxing. The flight touched down smoothly, wheels kissing the runway with a soft rumble. The passengers clapped again, louder this time, a mix of relief and excitement. The captain's calm voice followed. "Welcome to Washington, ladies and gentlemen. Local time is 6:42 p.m., and it's a beautiful evening. Thank you for flying with us." The seatbelt light went off. People stood, stretching, reaching for their bags, talking about the wild story they'd tell friends and family. She stayed seated for a moment, watching the lights outside, the ground crew moving in rhythm, the faint reflection of her face in the window. The older woman smiled at her. "Well, you made this one flight I'll never forget." "I think none of us will forget," she said softly. As the aisle began to clear, the young man offered to let her go first. She shook her head. "You go ahead. I'll take my time," he smiled. "Thanks for keeping us calm up there." She nodded once. "You did fine." When it was finally her turn, she stood, stretched slightly, and lifted her small backpack from under the seat. She walked slowly toward the front where the cockpit door was open. The captain stood there, shaking hands with passengers as they left. When she reached him, he smiled warmly. "Thank you again, Major. We owe you one." She smiled back. "You handled it perfectly, Captain. You kept everyone calm. That's not easy." He looked at her curiously. "You ever think about coming back?" She laughed lightly. "The sky always stays with you, but I think my flying days are behind me." "Well," he said, "you've still got the touch." She nodded in thanks and stepped out onto the jet bridge. The air was cooler now, with that familiar smell of kerosene and metal, the scent of airports everywhere. As she walked toward the terminal, she caught sight of something through the window, a dark shape far above. Circling once before heading away, she smiled. The F-22s were returning to base. Inside the terminal, crowds moved in every direction, people reuniting, rushing to connections, calling rides. She walked calmly through it all, blending in with the noise and movement. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message flashed across the screen. "Unknown number. Good to see you again, Falcon Actual. Respect from Guardian 2. Her hand stilled. She looked around instinctively as if expecting to see one of them nearby, though she knew they were miles above or already landing somewhere else. A small laugh escaped her. Quiet, warm, full of something between pride and disbelief. She typed back only 2 words. "Fly safe." Then she turned off her phone and slipped it into her pocket. As she walked toward the exit, she felt a strange peace wash over her. The airport announcements echoed overhead, boarding calls, baggage claims, final notices, but her mind was still in the sky. It struck her how life had brought her full circle without warning. She had tried to leave that world behind, but maybe it hadn't left her. Maybe it never would. Outside, the evening breeze carried the faint roar of another plane taking off. She paused, watching its lights disappear into the clouds. "Seat 14B, she whispered to herself, smiling. "Guess it still means something." Then she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked into the night, blending into the crowd, just another traveler with a quiet story the world would never quite believe. Morning light streamed through the hotel window, painting soft stripes across the floor. She had barely slept, though her body was tired. Her mind kept replaying the night before, the faint rumble of engines, the calm voice in her headset years ago, the sound of 2 jets flanking a plane full of unaware passengers. It had all felt like a dream. Except it wasn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the city wake up outside. Cars moved like slow streams below, people rushing toward their routines. She envied them in a quiet way, the simplicity of just having a normal morning. The TV played softly in the background. The news anchor's voice mentioned the unusual incident involving a commercial airliner escorted briefly by military jets. They didn't have the full story. They never would. She turned it off and smiled faintly. That was how she preferred it. Anonymous, ordinary. But deep down she knew yesterday had stirred something she thought was gone. She opened her bag, pulling out a worn leather folder. Inside were a few old flight patches, a small notebook filled with scribbled coordinates and weather notes, and a faded picture of her squadron taken years ago. In the photo, they were all smiling, arms around each other, flight suits dusty from long hours on the runway. She touched the edge of it gently. Some of those faces weren't around anymore. A knock came at the door. She hesitated before answering. When she opened it, a man in a plain jacket stood there holding an envelope. "Good morning, ma'am. Delivery for you," she frowned slightly. "Who's it from?" He smiled politely. No sender listed. Just said it's urgent. She took the envelope, thanked him, and closed the door. The paper was thick, official, military. Her pulse quickened slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a short note. "Major, the command sends its respect. Word travels fast. You reminded a few pilots what calm looks like. If you ever miss the sky, the door is always open." It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a name. She knew the tone. She could almost hear the steady voice of her old commanding officer, the same one who had told her to rest, to heal, to take time away. She folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. There was a small patch inside, too. A falcon embroidered in silver thread, with her old call sign stitched in neat letters. She laughed quietly. "You still remember?" After sitting in silence for a while, she packed her things, checked out, and stepped into the cool morning air. At the airport, people bustled as usual. The rhythm of travel, boarding calls, coffee lines, rolling suitcases, and was comforting. She walked through the terminal slowly, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel it again. The sound of jets outside, the faint hum in the walls, the pulse of movement. A child pointed out the window at a plane taking off, his eyes wide. "Look, Mom, that's so cool." She smiled at the pure excitement in his voice. That feeling, that spark, was why she had started flying in the first place. She found an empty seat by the window and sat for a while, watching the aircraft taxiing on the runway. She could almost imagine herself in one again. The checklist, the steady breathing, the feel of the controls under her hands. But then she thought of yesterday, how her voice alone had made trained pilots stop. Listen and act with precision. Maybe that was her place now, not in the cockpit, but as a reminder of what discipline and calm could do when chaos hit. She watched the clouds drift slowly across the sky. For a long time, she thought the sky had taken something from her career, her sense of purpose. But maybe it had just been waiting for the right moment to give something back. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it was short and simple. "Respect, ma'am. The sky's quieter when you're in it." She didn't know which pilot sent it, but she smiled anyway. A flight attendant passing by recognized her, the same one from yesterday's flight. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Just passing through," she said. "Headed home." The attendant sat for a second beside her. "You know, the captain told the whole crew what really happened. He said the Air Force confirmed it was you who made contact." She chuckled softly. "Word travels fast, doesn't it?" "It sure does," the attendant said. "You gave everyone hope. We've all been talking about how calm you were, how sure you sounded. It reminded me that sometimes one person's composure can change everything. That's kind of you to say." "It's true," the attendant said. "Anyway, safe travels. I hope you get to fly again in whatever way you want." "Thank you," she said, smiling. When the attendant left, she stood up and looked one more time at the sky outside. A passenger jet took off, its nose lifting gracefully into the air. She followed its climb until it disappeared into the clouds. She took a deep breath. Then she walked toward the exit. Outside, the sunlight was warm. A light wind swept through the parking lot, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and rain. She paused near the edge of the terminal, looking out toward the runways one last time. She could still hear the captain's voice in her memory, the tension in the cockpit, the confusion that had filled the air, and then the moment her call sign cut through it all. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Years of discipline had taught her that strength wasn't in volume. It was in certainty. She had found her voice again, in a place she hadn't expected it. Her cab arrived and she got in, glancing out the window as the airport shrank in the distance. The driver looked at her in the mirror. Traveling for business or pleasure? Neither, she said with a soft laugh. Just life. He nodded and turned up the radio slightly. A song played quietly, something about home and open skies. As the city rolled by, she thought about what came next. Maybe she'd return to teaching young pilots, maybe she'd just write, or maybe she'd simply live quietly by the sea somewhere. She didn't need medals or titles anymore. What mattered was knowing that when it counted, she was still who she had always been, calm under pressure, steady in chaos, loyal to the sky. The car passed under a long bridge, sunlight flashing through the rails. She watched it dance across her hands. For a second, she could almost see the reflection of her old fighter helmet in the glass, the one with her call sign stenciled in white letters, Falcon. She smiled. Still flying, she whispered. When the cab reached the train station, she stepped out and looked up at the sky one more time. A faint roar echoed above, a jet passing high overhead. It was just another flight to everyone else, but to her it was a heartbeat. A reminder. She raised her hand in a small salute, then turned toward the crowd, somewhere far above. Two pilots who had once called her ma'am might have been on patrol, laughing about the strange twist of fate that put their old mentor in seat 14B. Maybe they'd tell the story later, how their instructor's calm voice had come through when no one expected it. How one familiar call sign changed everything. And maybe one day, those words would travel beyond them, to a new pilot somewhere, facing their first storm in the sky. They'd remember the story, even if they never knew her name, because sometimes legends don't shout. They just speak clearly when it matters most. She walked toward the platform, the hum of engines fading behind her, replaced by the sound of trains and morning chatter. The world below had its own rhythm, steady, human, imperfect, alive. She smiled to herself, her heart calm. Seat 14B was behind her now, but its story would live on. Quiet proof that even far from the cockpit, a true pilot never stops protecting those who fly, and somewhere above the clouds the sky still carried her name.